Welcome to Part 3 of The Titanic's Fateful Journey. If you haven't caught Part 1 and Part 2 yet, make sure to give it a watch before diving into this one. Chapter 8. The Untold Story of the Titanic Wreck Salvage. The Titanic's discovery in 1985 sparked a debate over the ownership of the wreck and the valuable items inside and on the seabed around it. Ballard and his crew did not bring up any artifacts from the wreck, considering such an act to be tantamount to grave robbing. Ballard returned to the Titanic in 1986 for a more comprehensive exploration. Subsequent expeditions over the years utilized advancements in underwater technology to further study and document the wreckage. Subsequent explorations have found that the wreck is in relatively good condition, with many objects on the ship, jewelry, furniture, shoes, machinery and other items, are still intact. Ballard fought to protect the Titanic's legacy. Just 1 year after the wreckage was located, the U.S. Congress swiftly passed the RMS Titanic Maritime Memorial Act in July 1986. This legislation aimed to encourage the Titanic's designation as an international memorial site. Recognizing its dual significance as a site of global historical importance and a solemn resting place for those who tragically perished in the wreck. The act was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan on October 21, 1986. Regardless, the quest for artifacts motivated explorers to continue to plan expeditions to the Titanic and subsequently started battles for artifact rights that continue today. Less than a year after U.S. President Ronald Reagan signed a law proclaiming the Titanic a maritime memorial, Titanic Ventures Limited Partnership, a Connecticut-based consortium, which later became RMS Titanic, Inc., made a deal with the French oceanographic agency, IFREMER, for an artifact recovery expedition to the Titanic in 1987. The team returned to the site of the wreck and claimed it as their own by removing approximately 1,800 artifacts such as jewelry, china, etc. These artifacts have been carefully restored and used in traveling Titanic exhibits. So, what the heck is Titanic Ventures? The Titanic wreck was first discovered by a joint American-French expedition led by Hoy and IFREMER in 1985. Titanic Ventures was not directly involved in the planning or execution of the 1985 expedition. But Titanic Ventures, acknowledging the historical, cultural, and commercial significance of the discovery, realized that salvage rights were not yet established. In 1987, the company then contracted IFREMER to initiate salvage operations on the Titanic wreck. Using IFREMER's state-of-the-art technology, including the manned submersible Nautil, the expedition team recovered some 1,800 objects. Iconic artifacts included instruments from the stern docking bridge, a decorative cherub and several pursers or leather traveling bags. The expedition produced an outcry. Titanic survivor Eva Hart condemned what many saw as the looting of a mass grave.
To bring up those things from a mass sea grave just to make a few £1,000s shows a dreadful insensitivity and greed. The grave should be left alone. They're simply going to do it as fortune hunters, vultures, pirates.
Titanic Ventures pursued legal processes to obtain salvage rights to the Titanic wreck in a U.S. federal court. FYI, so what the heck is salvage law? Well, salvage law refers to the legal principles and regulations governing the recovery or rescue of vessels, cargo, or other property at sea in peril. The main concept behind salvage law is to provide an incentive for individuals or entities to assist in the recovery of ships, goods, or property in distress. In return for their efforts, salvors may be entitled to compensation or a reward. Salvage law traditionally recognizes the rights of salvors who first recover valuable property from the sea. The company argued that it had a legitimate interest in conducting salvage operations and recovering artifacts from the site. Seeking salvage rights through legal processes gives Titanic Ventures the legal authority to conduct operations to recover artifacts from the Titanic wreck. These artifacts, once recovered, could be exhibited in museums and touring exhibitions, attracting public interest and generating revenue. In the 1990s, U.S. federal court battles ensued over the exclusive salvage rights. including sole and exclusive ownership of any items salvaged from the Titanic wreck. Titanic Ventures won several of these legal skirmishes. In May 1993, Titanic Ventures sold its interests in the salvage operations and artifacts to salvage firm RMS Titanic, Inc., aka RMST, a subsidiary of Premier Exhibitions Inc. After legal wrangling, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia awarded RMST salver in possession status and exclusive rights over any items salvaged from the Titanic. After assurances by RMST that they intended to keep the collection together and not to sell individual artifacts, on June 4, 1994, the court likely considered the legal arguments presented by the company, including its intention to recover artifacts for historical and commercial purposes. The court's decision to grant salvage rights to RMS Titanic Inc. set a legal precedent for commercial entities to seek and obtain exclusive salvage rights to historic shipwrecks. This established a framework for balancing commercial interests with the historical and cultural significance of underwater cultural heritage. While the company did not discover the wreck first, it was able to secure salvage rights through a U.S. federal court decision. After the French-American team that discovered the Titanic in 1985 made no recovery claims. The court's decision, however, was not without controversy. Some critics raised ethical concerns about the commercialization of the Titanic wreck, and the precedent it set for treating historic shipwrecks as salvage opportunities. Museums and academics have criticized RMST for commercially salvaging artifacts in the first place. RMST also stoked outrage by trying to win the authority to auction off its artifacts. RMS Titanic Inc. conducted salvage expeditions in 1987, 1993, 1994, 1996, 1998, 2000 and 2004, 2010 until now, to collect thousands of artifacts from the Titanic site including top hats, china dinner plates, and a grand staircase cherub, etc. The artifacts were then exhibited in museums and traveling exhibitions worldwide. The company's involvement focused more on the commercial and educational aspects of showcasing Titanic artifacts rather than scientific research. You might wonder how the company can have salvage rights in international waters outside U.S. jurisdiction? Well, in the case of the Titanic, the rules that affect recovering artifacts differ, based on your country of origin. Exclusive rights to salvage items from the wreck were given to RMS Titanic Inc., aka RMST. This is only the case for the United States, however. These laws have no bearing on citizens of other countries. Since no one owns the Titanic, people are free to recover items from the ship if they are able. The United States granted salver in possession status to RMST, giving them the legal and exclusive rights to retrieve items from the wreck. Since the first manned exploration of the wreck of the Titanic, people have argued about what to do with what has been left behind. The wreck of the Titanic is not owned by anyone according to Admiralty law. If a ship sinks in international water, no one can make a claim to it. In an interview with The Journal, an Irish newspaper in 2012, Paul Loudon Brown, historian and White Star Line expert, shared that, "If I landed those objects in the U.S., then I could be arrested and those items seized. But if I brought them anywhere else, there would be no problem." Under Admiralty law, which the U.S., Britain and other major maritime nations adhere to, a vessel lying in international waters is effectively without ownership. And no one can actually stake a claim on it. But, the salvage of artifacts from the Titanic, or any shipwreck, is subject to international law and regulations. While RMS Titanic Inc. was granted salvage rights by a U.S. federal court, it's important to consider that the wreck of the Titanic is located in international waters. Given these complexities, salvaging artifacts from the Titanic by non-U.S. citizens would likely be subject to the legal frameworks of the countries involved, and the international agreements that aim to protect underwater cultural heritage. It is crucial for you or entities considering salvage operations to thoroughly research and comply with applicable laws and regulations to avoid legal repercussions. Additionally, the ethical considerations of preserving historical sites should be taken into account. After multiple court cases, a ruling allowed artifacts to be publicly exhibited. The court refused a subsequent request to sell the artifacts in 2001, and further planned auctions were subsequently postponed. RMST does face restrictions on what they are allowed to do with their findings. They must recover objects with the intent of preservation. According to a story done by National Geographic, RMST has been trying to win the right to sell items from its collection. This has been met with outrage by interested academics and museums interested in preserving the collection. But, some artifacts have been sold. For example, the Wallace Hartley violin, which sold for £1.1 million. A menu from the first meal aboard the Titanic sold for £51,000. An original deck chair for £101,999 and a launch ticket for £20,000. A waterlogged letter written by American businessman and Titanic passenger Oscar Halverson for £126,000 and Titanic memorabilia, etc. In 2016, Premier Exhibitions, which owned RMS Titanic, eventually filed for bankruptcy. In 2018, the legal and ownership landscape underwent changes. Salvage rights and about 5,500 Titanic artifacts were acquired by an investment group. Premier had tried to sell its Titanic artifacts prior to that, but encountered difficulty because restrictions imposed by a federal judge made it hard to sell them piecemeal. On 15 April 2012, the Titanic wreck, which lies in international waters, automatically became protected by UNESCO, under the 2001 Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, which protects cultural, historical, or archaeological objects that have been underwater for 100 years. This provides some protection to the Titanic by forbidding the commercial exploitation of heritage. The US and UK are not signatories to the convention but broadly honor its principles via legislation. In addition to that, there is also an international agreement concerning the Titanic. The agreement concerning the shipwrecked vessel RMS Titanic is an international agreement that protects the Titanic wreck, which is located in international waters. The agreement was signed in London on November 6, 2003, and by the US in 2004 and entered into force on November 18, 2019. The agreement explicitly states that any recovered materials should be kept together as a collection to enable study. Materials should be left on the seabed unless there are compelling educational, scientific or cultural interests that require an intervention. The agreement was a result of a recommendation made by Congress in the RMS Titanic Maritime Memorial Act of 1986. The agreement recognizes the unique historic significance and symbolic value of the Titanic, as well as the international interest in it. The treaty requires both the United Kingdom and the United States to regulate persons and vessels under their respective jurisdictions in their interactions with the wreck. Specifically, both countries can grant or deny licenses to permit entry into the shipwreck or to remove items from it. The UK has expressed its intention to urge other North Atlantic countries to join the agreement, especially Canada and France. Even though all the protective laws and agreements, on May 19, 2020, RMST once again won a battle in the Eastern District of Virginia and the organization was granted approval for an expedition to recover the Marconi radio from the wreckage. This is despite the fact the operation may involve damage to the hull, much of which remains intact 12,500 feet, aka 3,800 meters underwater. This case reverses a previous ruling from the 28th of July 2000 that prevents damage to the ship in line with existing agreements. A court ruling for such a culturally significant site that goes against advice from NOAA, aka the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, international agreements and the principles of UNESCO. Risks suggesting that the principles of shared heritage and selective intervention can be easily negated through simplistic arguments of degradation and profit. In this case, RMST plans to use robots to detach the radio from the ship. It will be the first time explorers have been allowed to alter the site. The room played a crucial role as the ship sank. It contains the wireless telegraph machine that sent the first Morse code messages to nearby ships when they hit the iceberg. That radio is one of the reasons that hundreds of people managed to survive. The justification for the removal of the radio was made on the basis of its unique status, interest to the public. and the threat that it will be lost to degradation in coming years. Each of these are valid points. The radio has a unique story, is highly evocative and will eventually degrade like the majority of materials. During the unmanned voyage, RMST wants to take photos of the wreck, enter the hull of the ship, and potentially recover artifacts. It is this last part of the plan that is controversial. A federal law and international agreements state that the shipwreck is a gravesite and a memorial to those who died in the disaster. The U.S. government argues that entering the hull of the ship breaks that law, and is concerned that going into the hull could disturb the artifacts and any human remains within it. RMST is not free to disregard this validly enacted federal law, yet that is its stated intent, argued U.S. lawyers. The shipwreck will be deprived of the protections Congress granted it. RMST claims that the government is infringing their rights and that the wreckage sits within international waters, beyond U.S. jurisdiction. Some believe that the case could take years and even end up in the Supreme Court. A judge granted RMST permission, but when the trip was postponed due to the pandemic, the U.S. government attempted to stop it from going ahead. It has been delayed indefinitely. It goes to the question of who has authority over the wreck site. John D. Kimball, a specialist in maritime law, told the New York Times. The issues are tricky, and the rulings are likely to be appealed. The RMS Titanic may not be the oldest shipwreck in the world, but it is arguably one of the most famous. The site is internationally recognized as a memorial to those who lost their lives. The company is now preparing a 2024 expedition plan that now only includes imaging at the wreck site and surveys to refine future artifact recovery. It's important to note that salvage law and the legal recognition of salvage rights can vary, and the decision in the case of the Titanic set a precedent that was specific to the circumstances surrounding the discovery and subsequent salvage efforts. The controversy over the commercial salvage of historic shipwrecks continues to be a subject of debate, in legal, ethical, and maritime heritage preservation discussions. By the time Ballard returned 18 years later, other companies had swooped in and swept up more than 6,000 artifacts, either selling them, $25 for a hunk of Titanic coal, for example, or putting them in a Titanic museum. It may have been Ballard's only regret about the whole experience. Yep, you already know who did that since you heard until now.
It had turned into an ugly carnival, an affront to the fate of Titanic and all those who had lost their lives in her final hours.
He writes. Dr. Ballard has shared his belief that Titanic's artifacts should remain in the sea, as it is a gravesite and memorial for all those that lost their lives. In addition, he believes that the underwater tourism and the salvaging of objects have hurt the integrity of the Titanic. Just as RMS Titanic Inc. wishes to reach a broad audience with the artifacts it collects and restores, Ballard wishes to do the same. The two sides have very different opinions on how to accomplish this goal. Instead of having underwater tourism or salvaging artifacts, Ballard wants to create a virtual tour. Ballard wishes to have lights and high-definition cameras on underwater movable vehicles, which would allow people to virtually visit the site and view it closely from many angles without disturbing the site. Yeah, it's definitely possible in today's technology even though it's a virtual tour. Which side are you on? Do you think that it is RMS Titanic Inc.'s duty to preserve artifacts and place them on display for the public? Or do you side with Robert Ballard and feel that it is a grave site that should be untouched and viewed only digitally? My thoughts. Gee. It's quite a dilemma, isn't it? Deciding whether to leave the wreck undisturbed or retrieve artifacts from it is no easy task. Here goes my personal view. I don't equate it to a gravesite on land that we often encounter. The wreck, while it might bear similarities to a gravesite, feels different to me. I'm not here to debate the logical difference, but that's just the way I sense it, or feel it. This ambiguity makes it challenging for me to perceive it strictly as a graveyard. However, it doesn't imply that we should go to any lengths to extract items from the wreck site. Respecting the lost souls is paramount, treating them with the intention to preserve our cultural heritage, for humanity's sake, rather than exploiting it for profit. In this regard, I strongly believe that the artifacts should be displayed in public spaces like museums, not sold off individually to private individuals or companies. So, that's my take. I'll wrap up the Titanic story in this video to delve into other intriguing stories. Until then, see you soon.